Hi, you're beautiful. Thanks for coming out. So I'm Philip Di Salvo. I'm a researcher and a journalist. I'm really honored, proud, and genuinely moved to have the chance to be here today introducing this talk. I will only take a few minutes to address why what you're going to hear today in this beautiful place matters so much and for all of us. Some stories are catalysts for so many different things, and this one is definitely one of those. This is a story about journalism, internet freedom, disobedience, injustice, and ultimately liberty. But let's start from how it ends. On May 17th, the International Day Against Homophobia, almost a month from now, Chelsea Manning will walk free. She spent the past 7 years behind bars for being the whistleblower and the source who provided WikiLeaks, its own media partners, and the global public opinion with 700,000 classified documents concerning the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US diplomatic correspondence, and I'm sure you heard this story already. Basically, Chelsea Manning has been our time's Daniel Ellsberg. As a consequence of her acts, Chelsea Manning was sentenced for 35 years in prison of violation of the Espionage Act and other offenses and faced a life in prison. That was the longest punishment ever imposed in the United States for a leak conviction. In his last week in office, President Obama gave Manning time served, and her sentence was commutated. Manning will be free soon, and she is the longest-serving whistleblower in the history of the United States of America. Although her release was a massive success and overwhelming good news, we should keep in mind how much the path to get there has been troubled and dangerous. In the past 7 years, Manning has been mistreated and jailed in conditions that have been defined by the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture as, and I'm quoting, cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment and in violation of Article 16 of the Convention Against Torture. For instance, Manning spent 3 years in jail waiting for a trial to begin, and for 11 months of that time, she was kept in solitary confinement. In 2016, Chelsea tried twice to kill herself. Everything in these 7 years has been a fight for Chelsea Manning. Her actual survival in jail, her health, the affirmation of her identity as a woman, the readings that she could keep with her, and even her haircut. All of this is a matter of public record. Chelsea Manning was even punished with more solitary confinement for trying to commit suicide. With incredible strength and resilience, she won so many battles, and we won. Chelsea Manning is my age, but my and her past 7 years have been radically different. I was an undergraduate journalist student when Manning was arrested in 2010, and I remember clearly when Collateral Murder was released, and I also remember reading Manning's infamous chat logs on Wired.com. For me, there was a wake-up call. But this is not about me. This is about my generation and the next to come. I think my generation owes Chelsea Manning a lot. For instance, we owe her knowing what the consequences of courage can be, and how tough and painful having one's own identity affirmed can be as well. We have barely heard Chelsea's voice in the past 7 years, and she has been physically invisible since she was jailed. As a generation, as a journalist and activist, we have the duty to preserve the memory of this story and to fight in order not to let it happen again to any whistleblower, truth teller, or anybody else. On May 17th, we will celebrate Chelsea's freedom. You are about to hear how this could happen, and it didn't happen out of a vacuum. This was the result of a battle, a constant fight for Chelsea's freedom and basic rights. You won't hear that story from me today. The person who's going to be on stage in a few moments is an exceptional example of commitment, passion, talent, and again, courage. As a campaign coordinator for Fight for the Future, she has been one of the loudest voices in this fight. She has been coordinating the work of journalists, activists, and lawyers who join forces for this battle in court and on the internet and elsewhere. And she is a personal friend of Chelsea Manning too. This is the story of how, literally, Chelsea Manning's life was saved. For this, I urge you all to give your loudest and warmest applause to Evan Greer.
Grazie. Grazie. Buongiorno. It's so good to be here with you today on a day that I thought, talking about something that many of us thought would never come to pass. And I'm going to tell you a bit about how we fought for Chelsea, but more importantly, how Chelsea fought for herself and fought for all of you and for all of us. Because I didn't save Chelsea Manning's life. Chelsea Manning saved her own life by surrounding herself with a community of people that cared passionately about her, that cared passionately about freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and who were willing to fight against what seemed like impossible odds to get her out of prison and to save her life. Chelsea was a more effective activist behind bars than I think I will be in my entire life in the free world. She managed to do all of this without access to a computer. She writes for The Guardian. She has a Twitter account. Can you imagine trying to write an article where every time you want to look something up, you need to call someone, hope that they are there, they cannot call you back, keep calling them until you get them, ask them to look it up for you, mail you the document, read it, and then write. These are the types of restrictions that she had placed upon her, and yet still was able to fight not only for herself, but for all transgender people in prison, and for the basic rights of all of us to express ourselves and to challenge power. I'm going to show a few slides, which always mess me up, so hopefully they won't today. But I'm going to show you this photo. This is the most recent photo that we have of Chelsea Manning, and we had to file a FOIA request and battle with the military to get it released. It's so important to understand the ways in which Chelsea's incarceration hid her from public view and made it much more difficult for us to advocate on her behalf, especially as a woman transitioning while in prison, not being able to control her own image, not being able to be seen, to go on TV, to talk directly to the media, was a huge barrier in Chelsea's ability to show herself and share herself with the world. And that's so much of what I and Fight for the Future and the people surrounding Chelsea worked to do, is to still allow her to share her voice with the world, even in the extreme conditions that she was being held in. I'm not going to talk a lot today about what Chelsea Manning did. You all probably already know. You can go look it up on her Wikipedia page or anywhere else. Instead, today I want to talk about who Chelsea Manning is, why she did what she did, what kind of person she is. So I'll go back to this photo of her while I talk about her. Chelsea Manning is one of the most brilliant, compassionate, funny, and charismatic people I've ever met. She was serving a 35-year sentence in an all-male military prison, and yet she has many friends. She played Dungeons and Dragons with her fellow inmates. She was in a rock band briefly. She was able to operate as an open-out transgender woman in this prison and was actually rather popular. And I think that speaks to the type of person that Chelsea is, and it speaks to why she did what she did in the first place, which is that Chelsea cares deeply about her fellow humans. And everything that she has done, from the time that she released documents exposing some of the US government's worst abuses in Iraq and Afghanistan, to continuing to fight for herself and for other trans prisoners while behind bars, has always been motivated by her undying desire to make the world a better place and to help others. Whenever Chelsea would call me, she would always ask how I was doing. She wanted to know if she could help me. What's the latest campaign that Fight for the Future is working on? How can I help? I'm so sorry I can't do more. She would literally say things like that to me while sitting in a prison cell, unable to use the internet, unable to walk outside other than in an enclosed courtyard. Remember also that Chelsea Manning was held for 7 months, as Philip said, in an extreme form of solitary confinement, where she was not allowed to lean back against the wall or lie down during the day. She was kept under 24-hour active observation. These are conditions that the United Nations considers to be torture. Briefly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Fight for the Future and who we are and what we do and how Chelsea found me. We're probably best known for organizing the massive online protests against SOPA, the internet censorship bill, when the internet blacked out. But we've also organized large campaigns against government surveillance. This summer, I organized a series of rock concerts with Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We work to use the internet, to defend all of our basic rights. But before coming to Fight for the Future, I worked on a variety of campaigns, including for a Muslim prisoner named Tariq Mahena, who was sentenced to 17 years for material support for terrorism, for translating an ancient Islamic text, which was then later used by groups associated with Al-Qaeda who he had no relation to. He did not fare as well as Chelsea, and that speaks to the deep racism and Islamophobia in US society. But it also earned me this great Breitbart headline, so there's that. As I mentioned, Chelsea runs a Twitter account. She speaks out on a wide variety of issues, not only on her own incarceration, but on transgender issues, issues of government transparency, issues of surveillance, and freedom of speech and freedom of expression, healthcare, LGBT issues. She has made herself a voice in the world despite the extreme conditions of her incarceration. Chelsea first reached out to me when I was on tour in Germany, and I distinctly remember feeling a little bit afraid that I wouldn't be allowed back into the US after talking to her on the phone while overseas. Fortunately, that didn't happen. I'm still worried going back tomorrow. And she reached out to me because she knew of my work supporting other prisoners. She knew of my work at Fight for the Future, and she knew that I was trans. And we immediately connected. We talk on the phone about once a week. I've laughed with her. I've wept with her. We talk about things like makeup and pop culture, but also cryptography and the Black Panther Party and history and philosophy. Chelsea is one of the most amazing strategists that I've ever met, and it's so important to understand that she's only getting out of prison because of her own ability to connect people. She connected me with other activists. She connected me with her attorneys. Her attorneys are incredible people that were willing to work with us as activists, and this is so important. Many attorneys for political prisoners tend to shy away from activism. They want to shut activists that are supporting their clients out of the process. And that has caused great detriment to many prisoners that I've tried to support and that others have tried to support. In Chelsea's case, she has a posse. Her lawyers care deeply about her, and they believe in her, and they believed that she was worth fighting for. And that made all the difference for us as activists in our ability to fight for her as well. I want to give a shout out because there's so many different organizations and groups and people that helped make this happen. Long before I ever got in touch with Chelsea, there was the Chelsea Manning Support Network, who did incredible work raising awareness about her case. Well, where's that slide? Okay, it's not coming up. And groups like Courage to Resist, who support whistleblowers. These folks have been fighting for Chelsea since before her transition, since before her trial, during her trial. And so while many of us who fought for her toward the end are now sort of getting credit for getting her out of prison, it really was a group effort from so many different grassroots organizations from across the political spectrum. And I think that's very important to recognize. Maybe people see Chelsea Manning, well, she's a transgender woman, she's lauded by anti-war activists, and assume that her support comes from the left in the United States. But that's not actually true. Her support comes from all over. She gets letters from libertarians, from conservatives, from other transgender women from across the political spectrum. She has support because she speaks truthfully, and she has carried herself with dignity and respect throughout. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different things that we did to support Chelsea. So this is an example of Chelsea actually wrote a piece of legislation to dismantle the FISA courts in the United States that authorize mass government surveillance. So one of the things we did was to try to amplify her voice by encouraging lawmakers in the United States to read the bill that she was written. We first started working on Chelsea's case when she was threatened with additional solitary confinement for having an expired tube of toothpaste in her cell and possessing the Caitlyn Jenner issue of Vanity Fair, among other LGBT-related reading materials. This is just part of a pattern of harassment from the government while she was in prison. They were consistently putting her in fear of additional solitary confinement, which again is a form of torture, in an attempt to silence her. And that was their goal. But it never worked. Every time they did something like this, we would react, we would organize online campaigns, we would deliver petitions, and she had so much support that we barely had to do anything. We would tell the world about what was happening to Chelsea, we would tell journalists, we would tell the press, people would pay attention, and we were able to help. Eventually, Chelsea went on hunger strike demanding access to the gender-related health care that she had been systematically denied for years while in prison, which caused her extreme distress, feelings of dysphoria, depression, and contributed to her attempts at suicide. We finally won that fight, or Chelsea really won that fight on her own through this hunger strike, which we helped publicize. And in doing so, if she were not to get out on May 17th, she could be the first transgender person in a United States prison to receive gender-related surgery. Now, Chelsea's not going to need that surgery while in prison because she's going to walk out on May 17th, which is the day before my birthday, by the way. So that's the best birthday present I've ever gotten. But she's still set a legal precedent that will benefit literally thousands of transgender people in prisons in the United States. And she did so at great risk to herself. She was already in trouble. She was already facing solitary confinement for quote-unquote infractions in the prison. And yet she stood up for herself. She went on hunger strike. She fought for all of us. And every time I would talk to her, she would always say, I want you to talk about the other prisoners. My situation is bad. Other transgender people in prison have it worse. Talk about them. She was always compassionate, always thinking about others, and even in her darkest moments, she held this quiet optimism that blew me away. After Chelsea attempted to take her own life, the government continued to harass her. Prison officials threatened her, again, with more solitary confinement. This was their mode. Again, they had tortured her for months, and then they tried to keep her in a state of constant fear of being tortured again. This was their way of attempting to break her down, to crush her spirit, to get her to stop tweeting, stop writing, stop talking to us. And again, it never worked. Each time we were able to work as a network, work with her attorneys, work with groups of activists like Demand Progress, like Daily Kos and others, to spread the word and generate massive outcry each time the government attempted to silence Chelsea. Following the suicide attempt, we collected, once again, more than 100,000 signatures on a petition, and yet the government still put her in solitary confinement for 14 days as a direct result of her attempt to take her own life. This was a turning point, in my opinion, where journalists in the United States stopped making stories about Chelsea Manning about whether what she did was right or wrong, and started recognizing that regardless of how you feel about the initial leaks, the way that the government was treating this human being was unacceptable. That was a moment when we started to gain real traction and political power in a meaningful way. Chelsea had developed relationships with journalists herself. She wrote directly to folks like Charlie Savage at the New York Times. She has a bit of a southern, polite attitude. She would send thank you cards to activists and to journalists who she felt did a fair and balanced job of covering her case. And we, as her intermediaries, were able to coordinate with journalists who, again, started to understand that the real story here was no longer about something that happened 7 years ago. It's about what was happening now to a human being in a US prison that deserved basic dignity and respect and deserved to not be tortured. I think that's what's so important about Chelsea, is that she didn't want to be seen as a hero. She wanted people to know her for who she was. She wanted her voice to be authentic. If you read her Twitter account, it's full of like smiley faces and like cat ears and things like that. That's Chelsea showing herself to the world, not as someone to be put up on a pedestal or worshipped or thought of as a hero or even a whistleblower. She actually hated the term. She just wanted to be known as Chelsea, as a person who cared about others and has always tried to do the right thing by doing so. I want to talk a little bit about how Fight for the Future, I think, was able to be effective in working for Chelsea. We're an extremely small organization. There's about 7 of us, give or take, as we add and subtract people every year. We have no attorneys that vet everything that we write or say. We operate completely remotely using the internet. So we're able to respond extremely quickly. We're very small and nimble in that way. That gave us the ability that every time something happened with Chelsea, we could put out a press release immediately, have her lawyer look at it, and get it out into the world. She could call me and tell me something was happening, and I could have it up on Twitter moments later, and we could be generating awareness about what was going on with her. This gave us an ability to quickly respond to the government's attacks on Chelsea while she was in prison, which helped us build a huge base of support for her. Every time we did one of these petitions that gathered tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of signatures, we would then be able to email those people and ask them to call the Secretary of the Army or ask them to contribute to her legal fees or to the efforts around her case. So we were able to build this massive army, if you will, that was at Chelsea's back, there to support her, which again consisted of people from across the political spectrum. And to me, that was so powerful because the U.S. military doesn't care a whole lot about what leftists and progressives think, right? And so having legitimate voices from across the spectrum that were calling for Chelsea's release, that were explaining how what she did actually strengthened the United States and benefited our ability to operate as a democratic society made a huge difference in terms of our ability to get her out. We also, of course, worked with the media. I wrote tons of op-eds for The Guardian and for Huffington Post and for others about Chelsea from so many different angles, whether it was responding when Barack Obama was named the LGBT Advocate of the Year by one of our popular gay rights magazines. And of course, his administration was actively denying Chelsea Manning access to the medically recommended treatment that she needed. This was actually in a reversal of the Obama administration's own decisions about how transgender prisoners should be treated. They had said that they should receive this treatment, but they excluded Chelsea from that up until we were able to fight and get that overturned, and the ruling around transgender people in the military came down. Then those benefits extended to her. But again, every single thing that Chelsea had in prison, from makeup to some appropriate clothing to therapy and other gender-related health care, we had to fight for, and Chelsea had to fight for. And those things were essential for keeping her alive. Even after she attempted to take her own life, the first thing she told me when she called me was that she was glad it didn't work. She was glad to be alive. And the reason she was glad to be alive was because she knew how much people out here cared for her and were willing to fight for her. And that made all the difference. As we came toward what ended up being the end of the campaign, though of course we had no idea that that was the case, there was a news story that suggested that Chelsea Manning was on President Obama's short list for commutation. So we knew that this was the moment. It was do or die. We assumed it was what we call a trial balloon, where they were sort of testing the waters with this story to see how the public would react. So we mounted this online campaign called Hugs for Chelsea, and got thousands of these incredible photos of people with their arms outstretched who are waiting to give Chelsea Manning a hug. And for me, this was such an emotional campaign because I have never seen Chelsea face to face. She was not allowed to meet with members of the press or with any member of the public who she did not already know before she was in prison. So even though I speak to her on the phone once a week, even though we laugh and talk and joke about pop culture and makeup and everything else, I've never been able to see her face other than in that photo that I showed you at the very beginning. And for me, the idea of being able to give Chelsea a hug when she walks out of prison on May 17th is what has kept me going throughout this process. And I can't tell you how many times throughout this, someone told me, whether it was a journalist or someone from the administration or policy nerds or wonks or whoever, that it's good what you're doing, but it's never going to work, right? You know that. This is impossible. You're not going to get her out of prison. But if there's one thing that I've learned as an activist, it's that anytime someone in power tells you that something is impossible, that just means it's worth doing. And they will always tell you that it's impossible. They'll always try to deter you, discourage you, make you feel like it's not worth it. But that should be a sign that you're on to something really good and that you should keep fighting. And that was what was so important to me, was that even in those darkest moments when I let that stuff get to me, when I internalized that idea that we were fighting for something impossible, Chelsea still believed. Chelsea believed that she was right. She believed that her appeal was legally sound. She believed in her supporters. She believed in all of you. And she was right in the end. And to me, while I couldn't have predicted that, I did always believe in Chelsea. And while a lot of what we did was sort of trying to make her life a little bit less hell, while assuming that she would serve the next 3 decades in prison, all of that work ended up building this public outcry, building this overwhelming grassroots push that made it more politically feasible for Barack Obama to commute her sentence than to do nothing. And that's something I've learned, again, as an activist. Like, when fighting for net neutrality in the United States, the former commissioner of the FCC was our enemy number one. He was the one that we had to fight. He wasn't giving us what we wanted. We demonized him. We attacked him. And on the day that he actually approved the net neutrality regulations that we wanted, he said it was the proudest day of his policy career. And that gave me pause, because I was like, wait, you're the enemy, dude. You're proud of this? And it turns out that he was. And I looked him in the eye, and I believe him. And that helped me remember that there are some people in power who are just evil and want to harm us and are beholden to their corporate overlords or whatever it is. But then there's many people who are in power who don't give us what we want because they don't believe it's possible, because they've heard the same thing that we keep hearing, that it's not possible. Don't try. It's not worth it. And what we need to do as activists is usually not just to convince them that we're right, not just to convince them that Chelsea Manning should go free, convince them that mass surveillance harms our society, convince them that racism and bigotry are unacceptable and that we shouldn't ban people from our country based on where they're from. Many times they know that we're right, they just believe that they can't do it. And what we need to do is convince them that things are politically possible and change the world, change society in such a way that things become politically possible. And that's what we did with Chelsea Manning. I don't know how Barack Obama felt about it, but I know that in the end, he felt that he could do this and that it wouldn't be the end of his life, the end of his career, the end of his popularity. He felt it was possible. And that's because of all of you and all of us and the work that we did to transform society, to transform the public's view of who Chelsea is and the idea that she deserved to be treated with basic human dignity. That's what got Chelsea Manning out of prison. It was that sea change in the way that people viewed her. And that happened through coordination, again, with her activists, with attorneys, with journalists who would write about her case, with artists who created podcasts. She wasn't able to speak directly to the public, so we had podcasts that were things that she had written, voiced by an actress, for example. There was an artist that used her DNA to create a statue of her, for example. These were ways that we tried to make Chelsea visible even while the government was trying to hide her away from us and keep her out of public view. I'll show a few more of these slides. Another thing that we were able to do is get support from well-known people and celebrities. So Sean Ono Lennon, John Lennon and Yoko Ono's son. Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth wrote a song for Chelsea. Michael Stipe from REM would post videos for us. But again, all of this was Chelsea, not us. These people would reach out to us and say, hey, I'm a huge supporter of Chelsea Manning. I believe in what she did. I believe that she is fighting for all of our basic rights. How can I help? And in the end, these headlines they make my heart flutter. Of course, we won. And for me, I have a 6-year-old, a child, and my child would ask me about Chelsea almost every day. She would be around when Chelsea would call me, and I would say, oh, it's Chelsea, my friend who's in prison. And the day that I was able to tell my child that Chelsea Manning was getting out of prison was the first time that I actually wept after the commutation, because I knew that my child was now growing up in a world where she believed that change was possible. She believed that through activism, through working together, we could save someone's life. We could get someone out of prison from behind this oppressive system. And more than anything, knowing that the generation to come will have these examples of how ordinary people, without a ton of money, without large organizations or even international NGOs or government support, can change the world, that matters to me more than anything. And I know that that matters to Chelsea too, that it's not just about her, it's about what is to come. And so my question that I want to leave you with is, as journalists, as activists, as people who care about human rights, what are we going to do to make sure that what happened to Chelsea Manning never happens to anyone else. What happened to Chelsea was unacceptable, and unfortunately, there's nothing preventing it from happening again right now. We have completely inadequate legal protections for whistleblowers in the United States and in many other countries. We have a culture of fear where people are more than willing to scapegoat someone who the government says harmed national security, even when there's zero evidence that that is the case, even when military officials themselves acknowledge that that is not the case, as is the case with Chelsea. So what are we going to do? And what responsibility do journalists have to fight for whistleblowers who immensely benefit the profession? So many news stories were generated by the documents that Chelsea Manning released. And this is a time, an unprecedented time in history, when everyone, journalists included, needs to decide, are you going to work in support of unchecked authoritarianism in power, or are you going to work against it? There is no fence sitting at this point. And if we're going to work against it, that means actively fighting to support whistleblowers. Journalists need to be speaking out publicly, organizing publicly, and as a profession, demanding protections for the people that feed so many stories that benefit the public interest. So I leave you with this question: what will you do? And I'll ask it to myself, what will I do once Chelsea gets out of prison? What comes next? How will we fight to make sure that what happened to her never happens again? Thank you so much. I'm going to take a bunch of questions.
Wow. Where to start from? Let's start again from the end. So in a month from now, as we were saying, we will celebrate Chelsea's freedom. And what happens to her? What do you think is she going to do out of prison? She has basically spent her adult life in prison, so she has to start everything again from scratch. What is she going to do?
I know she wants a hamburger. She has told me that. And she wants to go dancing. But she'll be able to speak for herself for the first time when she's out of prison. And she will, I'm sure, quickly tell the world what she wants to do. But I know that she wants to continue being an advocate and an activist and a voice in the world. And again, not only on issues of government transparency and for whistleblowers and prisoners, but she's incredibly passionate about issues of bettering our society, and in a very innovative way. She certainly does not identify as a leftist, which I find very interesting, and yet she supports universal health care. Yeah. She is a deep thinker and wants to bring that into US politics as a voice that calls for us to think critically about how our government and our society works and how we can improve it to better the lives of everyone.
And I think this is, well, and this is definitely one of the greatest news of the past years, like having Chelsea out of prison. And what does it mean for the US? I mean, you're living very troubled times after Trump's election, and do you think that could have like an impact in kind of making more voices raised from the bottom up in trying to change things? Do you think that Chelsea represents a precedent or some? I mean, her battle represents a precedent that could, make a real impact on what's going on?
We certainly needed some good news, but I think we're also living in a time when we are desperately going to need whistleblowers now more than ever. This administration has shown itself to be an enemy of basic human rights, an enemy of basic human decency, and we need people within that administration to tell the world what is going on. And so having those people know that if they do the right thing, people will come together to fight for them, and that isn't just a fruitless fight that is like nice to have and good to pat ourselves on the back because we tried, but that we can actually win and prevent the darkest fate from occurring, should help encourage and embolden people to speak truth even in these most extreme situations. And then beyond that, I think just the public needed to know that we could make change in that way. And so reminding people that grassroots power does exist and that we can, in fact, do things that people believe to be impossible is a sentiment that I think we need now more than ever.
And looking back at what happened from 2010 until today, we had many whistleblowers. We had Chelsea Manning, we had John Kiriakou, and many others, and we had Edward Snowden 3 years after Manning. And since Snowden was here in video a couple of years ago at this festival, the battle for Chelsea was won overwhelmingly, but the war to protect whistleblowers and keep them safe out of prison is still long, and it will get tougher, I'm afraid. Do you think that also could speed up in a way, and there could be a process to stop this constant attack against whistleblowing that is going on in the US and elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is around culture change. Legal protections are great, but we know that the US government is certainly willing to bend and break most of the restrictions that it places on itself, especially when it comes to surveillance or treatment of prisoners. So while I do want there to be legal protections for whistleblowers in place, I don't think that that's enough. Mm-hmm. I think part of what we need to do is change people's perception of the importance of loyalty versus justice. And I think, one of the things I heard so often with Chelsea was people who were like, well, yeah, she exposed some bad stuff, but she took an oath, and she was in the military, and she should never have done that because she took an oath. And to me, that's just such a backwards way of thinking. She took an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, and she followed through on that oath. And the idea that your loyalty should be to a hierarchy or an institution or a repressive regime rather than to your fellow humans makes no sense to me, and I think hopefully makes no sense to most of us. And I think changing that perception of what loyalty means and where our loyalties should lie is what we really need to do to protect whistleblowers in the long run. And
I think that what was published, thanks to Chelsea, has been redefining a lot of things that we used to know, like the relationship between secrecy and diplomacy. It basically started data journalism, and everything that comes to accountability and transparency in government has been completely rewritten by those revelations that were published through WikiLeaks 7 years ago now. In your opinion, what was the biggest contribution that Chelsea gave to public opinion thanks to her whistleblowing act?
I think it's hard to pick the biggest, I mean, a lot of people harp on the diplomatic cables as if that somehow crossed the line. But for myself, I think diplomacy is such an important thing to shed light on. Beyond simply war crimes and the collateral murder video and things like that, the public deserves to know what their government is doing in their name, the types of negotiations that they're having. And I think shedding some light on the way that US imperialism works behind closed doors is important. And I think it pushed journalists to look into those things in a way that they maybe hadn't before. And it pushed for journalists to think about sources and where they could get information. And as you said, it kind of started data journalism in this way. I mean, it was such a massive, massive trove of information. There was no way to just kind of glance at it and write up the summary. And so I think, it created this moment. I'm not going to say that Edward Snowden wouldn't have happened without Chelsea, but maybe not, and certainly maybe the climate of journalists that were ready to listen to him and do the work to push those stories out and to educate the public about what was going on in the profound way that they did. I think Chelsea Manning set the stage for that to occur and suffered immensely for it, but in the end, immensely benefited our society.
And speaking about journalists, since we are at the journalist conference, you already mentioned that during your talk, but newspapers are still profiting from that material that Chelsea put in public record. And in 2014 or 15, I don't recall precisely the year, Project Censored, which is a no-profit organization in the US that publishes every year a ranking of the most censored news of the year, said that the Manning trial was basically not covered by the US press, except for exceptional examples like Alex O'Brien and other journalists, frequently freelancers, who were there. Why that? Basically, is that the journalists care about the story but not about the source? Or what's the problem in this?
I think that was part of the problem, and I think also there's a huge problem in the mainstream press in the United States that and I think this is changing somewhat just because this administration is so adversarial toward the press, but journalists, especially at very high levels that cover things like national security, are incredibly dependent on those anonymous administration sources that give them the story first. And they don't want to piss them off. Yep. And so a lot of the type of censorship that happens in the United States is self-censorship, where journalists pick and choose what stories they cover based on not wanting to anger these anonymous administration officials that give them information when they need it. And I think, journalism is changing, and that's changing that, and so the New York Times and Washington Post, bless their hearts if you're here, are not the only game in town anymore. And that changes the culture of journalism at those institutions as well. And again, like Charlie Savage at the New York Times did a fantastic job covering Chelsea's case, especially more recently. But I think, again, the issue is with the relationship that journalists have to the government, and that internal little voice that says, like, well, maybe I don't need to cover this story in this way. But again, I think over time that changed, and a lot of journalism about Chelsea in the U.S. was also a little bit sensational. It was sort of like, oh, this like interesting trans woman, that's so interesting. Mm-hmm. And in some ways that actually benefited our case because it helped us elevate her story. But at least being here and talking to European journalists, it seems like there was a stronger understanding of who she was and why she really mattered. And I think I'm seeing that changing in the U.S. as well. And that's sort of all of our duty to change the face of journalism, which I think all of you are doing. I mean, this conference is such an amazing example of that.
I have one last question before opening to the public. We named this talk How Chelsea Manning's Life Was Saved, which is also a quote from Chase Stranger, who is one of the attorneys that has been helping Chelsea during her battle, and he also contributed in making this happen, so I wanted to mention him and thank him for that. Did you really feel at a certain point that that really couldn't happen and that Chelsea's was really in danger of dying in prison? We said she tried to commit suicide twice. That was probably the darkest moment of her story. And did you fear that that really could happen?
Absolutely. There were points when I had resigned myself to it to a certain extent. When she called me after the first time that she attempted to take her life, again, she told me she was glad it didn't work and she was glad to be alive and wanted to keep fighting. But it was so hard to imagine her surviving for 30 more years in the conditions that she was being held in. Again, and she never had problems with other inmates. If the government wasn't constantly harassing her, threatening her with more solitary confinement, bringing her up on these frivolous infractions, she probably could have survived those 35 years. Not that she would want to or that anyone should have to. But it seemed like the government was intent on killing her, essentially, or driving her to that point. And so, it was, and she has said this, and her lawyers know as well, I firmly believed that the grassroots support, that the campaign, that all the organizing did in fact not only get her free from prison early, but saved her life, and that without that work, she might not be with us today, or certainly not in 5 years or 10 years, which would have been just such a loss for the world. Chelsea Manning is a voice that we need. We need more people like Chelsea Manning in the world now more than ever, and that would have been a devastating loss to humanity if we had lost Chelsea. So I'm so grateful that we're not losing her, and instead we're going to have her, and I'm going to be able to hug her, and she's going to be able to continue sharing herself and doing her incredibly important work.
Okay. We can take questions from the audience, and I'm sure there is a microphone somewhere for you. So raise your hand. There's one down there, the first one I saw.
Delio Vaccarello dell'Unità.
I think this translation. Pardon. Just a second.
Un moment.
Okay. Mi chiamo Delio Vaccarello, sono una giornalista dell'Unità. Innanzitutto i miei più sentiti complimenti e congratulazioni per tutto quello che avete fatto.
No?
Senti? No.
This one is on. Sorry.
I can hear her.
Ok? Ci sei? Mi senti? Sì. Grandissimi complimenti e congratulazioni per tutto quello che avete fatto. Mi ha colpito molto quando tu hai detto il problema era nel rapporto tra la lealtà e la giustizia. Ci rispondevano bisogna essere leali rispetto al giuramento prestato. E ho subito pensato che una delle risposte che hanno dato i criminali nazisti hanno sempre detto noi rispondevamo agli ordini. Questa questione, tutta questa vicenda è andata a buon fine anche perché, secondo me, c'era Obama ed erano anche gli ultimi momenti dell'amministrazione Obama. Adesso c'è Trump, che è un nemico giurato dei giornalisti e non solo. Come pensi che questa situazione cambi? Cioè, avere un nemico del giornalismo, avere un nemico dichiarato dei diritti umani, come può cambiare questa situazione culturale, questa tendenza all'autocensura, questa sorta di preferenza verso la lealtà e non verso la sostanza della giustizia? Grazie.
Grazie. I think it's very important to remember that while I do give Barack Obama some credit for the political courage that it took to release Chelsea Manning and Oscar Lopez Rivera as well, I wouldn't call him a friend to human rights. His administration prosecuted more people under the Espionage Act than any other administration in history. His administration deported more people from the United States than any other administration in history. He carried out drone bombings across the world. And so while the new administration is clearly more open about its animosity toward human rights and toward journalists, it's not like we were operating where we were working with an administration that was working with us. Barack Obama's administration was responsible for all of the treatment of Chelsea that we just discussed, the denial of the health care that she had, the solitary confinement. And so while it can feel a little bit more hopeless now, and while there may have been more hope with an administration that at least paid lip service to things like human rights, and now we have one that doesn't at all, it's just important to remember that we're always up against what feels like insurmountable odds. And while this administration may seem completely unwilling to listen, I don't know that Barack Obama's administration was willing to listen until we forced them to listen. And that is essentially always the case when dealing with governments that are beholden to powerful institutions that don't benefit the general public. And so I think the answer is that yes, things are going to get harder before they get better, but we need to keep fighting. And in the end, it's always about creating the political situation where it is more painful for them to do what you don't want than for them to do what you do want. And I think that's the thing that I've learned as an activist, is that, again, it's not about convincing them that it's right. Doesn't really matter whether they think it's right. And I don't think we'll ever convince Donald Trump that something that we think is right is right. But we can convince him that it's harder to do the thing that's wrong because of the political pain that we as activists can cause. And so I think that's, in the end, the solution, is continuing to build our power to the point that we can push this administration and the ones to come to do the right thing, whether in the United States or around the world.
There's another question down there.
I just wanted to say thank you, Philip, for your statement, your eloquent statement. And also, Evan, I just wanted to say thank you. That's all. And
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for sharing this incredible story of activism and human rights defense. The question I have is, what has this experience taught you about how should journalists deal with cases of human rights abuse, especially not in countries like in the US, where you still have a functioning justice system, but especially in countries where there's repressive governments and where that international pressure from Western countries like the US, Germany, Italy, the UK, could make the difference, but it's sorely lacking because of other interests, of other problems. Thank you.
This is a great question. I think the most important thing for journalists is to always be skeptical of the government's story. There's always so much more to the story than you're going to get from officials, who give you the official press release. And I think, especially at very, quote-unquote, high-level journalism or very political journalism, there's a tendency to want to rely only on, verified sources, which generally means official sources. And yet, those sources have such a strong bias in terms of how they're viewing a story. And so making sure that you're talking to people who are actually affected, people who are actually close to the source, close to what is happening, is so critical. And not just doing, he said, she said, Z said, they said in your story, but actually trying to determine, to collect information and determine something close to what is true. I think so often we have stories, where you have, well, so-and-so said this, and then this senator said that, and this CEO said this, and that's the story. And I can't tell you how many times as an actor, one great example is my good friend Sam Thielman at The Guardian was brought on NPR to talk about one of Fight for the Future's campaigns instead of us. Because things get filtered through this power filter where it's like, oh, we need someone really prestigious. Activists are not prestigious. They're smelly and don't have any money. And so I think going to the source, not filtering things through that power filter where you feel like someone needs to have some letters after their name in order to quote them, but actually listening to the people who are closest to the story, I think is the most important thing for covering human rights, or covering anything really. But I think also just pushing against the false dichotomy of the West. I think there's so much journalism about oh, things are really bad over there in those countries where they're so oppressive and terrible to the gays and things like that. When we have a prisoner in the United States being held by an administration that claimed to support transgender people being denied basic access to health care and driven to the point of attempting to take her own life because of that administration's policies. So we shouldn't create false equivalencies, but we also shouldn't pretend that human rights abuses only happen over there in those countries. But look in the mirror for journalists in the US and in Europe. I think that's critically important as well.
I think we have time for one more question. Raise your hand if you have one.
Yeah.
If not, I'm going to ask you one last thing to close down this. And the whole story of Chelsea Manning is about speaking out. And she's going to be able to do that live, in the flesh, in front of a camera, and in front of people, in front of all of us. Since you know her, although you never met in person, what do you think is the first thing that she's going to say? What is she really feeling like, fuck, I'm going out, and I'm going to say this?
She's such an incredibly humble person that I'm almost positive the first thing that she will do is to say thank you to all of you and everyone who spoke for her and fought for her. And I'm sure that she will also try to take the focus off of herself as quickly as possible and put it back on what's going on in the world and what we all need to do to make a difference. Because Chelsea, again, is just driven by an undying desire to benefit the public, to help people, to push back against injustice. And I'm sure that that is what she will use her voice for the moment that she walks out of those prison doors and into the light.
Evan, our time is up. And I would like to thank you so much for being here, for sharing your experience and your work. I would like to thank the whole organization of the festival. And if Chris and Oriana are in the room, I would like to have them here on stage as well. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming out. Thanks for the volunteers and the translators. And thank you again.
All. Thank you. Grazie. Yeah. We did it.
For you.
What a performance.
This changes everything.
Let's get this party started.